Thank you very much, General. Thank you very much. And I also thank the Indic Researchers Forum for organizing this conference. It is a very important conference. It is timed very well. Uh, One reason because we are now we've been seeing the war that has been happening between between Israel and Gaza. At this point in time, we saw the dastardly terrorist attack that happened on October 7th. Soon we will be having the 15th anniversary of the deadly terrorist attack that Mumbai saw in 2008. And also, this happens to be the 30th anniversary of the 1993 Bombay blasts. Now, the reason I'm stating all these facts is because before starting the conversation about the nexus between organized crime groups or criminal entities and the jihadist groups, we need to understand how complex this problem of jihadism itself is, especially in our context, that is the Indian subcontinental context, right? So, for example, let's take the 1993 bomb blast that happened in Bombay, right? There were 12 serial blasts that bombs that went off, and eventually we realized that it was conducted by cadres of the organized criminal groups, the D Company, Dawood Ibrahim's gang, and so on. So that became the first instance when people started to talk about this jihad crime nexus, because there were criminal entities who carried out this attack, which is clearly a jihadist attack. But the biggest challenge in terms of regarding this as a jihadist attack is that there was no organization to take credit for that attack after that, right? Because it was not carried out by a non-state actor. It was not carried out by a jihadist organization, right? Instead, what we had was it was a state actor, meaning that it was the world's first legitimately created Islamic state that had carried out this particular attack. It was its intelligence agencies which was responsible for orchestrating this attack, and it was a man by name Lieutenant General Javed Nasser who was the brains behind this. And now that's where this attack actually gets the jihadist character, because Lieutenant General Javed Nasser was a member of the JEI, the unit that most of our previous speakers have spoken about so eloquently. Now, what he does after retirement is he joins an organization called Tablighi Jamaat, and eventually, this is another complexity that we need to address here, is that he goes on to become the chairman of a group called the Sikh SGPC, that's the Sikh Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee, right? The Sikhs have nothing to do with jihadism, yet they found an alliance of convenience because both stand for the disintegration, disunity, and the breakup of India, right? So when you're talking about the jihadist threat, right, the subcontinental jihadist threat is far more complex. It is not just a nexus between organizations that we can regard as jihadist organizations. It is not just a nexus between those organizations and organized criminal groups, but it is a triangular nexus between organized criminal groups, jihadist organizations, and state actors who exude this character of jihadism in one way or the other. So this is a complexity that we need to bear in mind, because I'll revisit this and it will help us make better sense of the problem that other nation states are facing in terms of tackling the menace challenge posed by the crime terror nexus. So now moving to the whole concept of crime terror nexus itself, there is a saying which goes that crime breeds terror and terror feeds on some form of crime. So they're deeply interlinked, and this interlinking operates on an individual level, on at an organization level, and at a strategic level, right? So we need to understand at all these levels to really make sense of why criminal groups or why criminals have a nexus with terrorist organizations. Now, let's start from the individual level, right? So many studies have been conducted, especially in the European theater, and I can speak from experience within the Indian theater, especially from the state of Karnataka, right? So what we see is that for many of the criminals, taking to jihad or adopting jihadist terrorism is one of the forms of redemption. Now, many hundreds of European, people from Europe who went to join the Islamic State in the Middle East, they all had some form of criminal record, criminal past. Even in India, when you look at what happened in the year 2022, there was something known as the Mangalore, there was an explosion in an auto rickshaw that happened just about last year. We see that even this particular individual who carried out this attack, let me just note his name. His name was Mohammed Sharik. So even this individual, he had a criminal past. He was initially in a prison where he was radicalized. And many of these individuals, what they say is that this carrying out jihadist form of terrorism or sacrificing themselves for this jihadist cause is a form of redemption from their past criminal activities, right? So this is something that we need to remember, because some of them also go on to become terrorist leaders, right? Most of us have this sort of misconception that an Ayman al-Zawahiri or Anwar al-Awlaki, most of these terrorist leaders that we talk of, Al-Qaeda leaders and so on, they come from well-to-do families. They are really rich. Some of the past speakers in this particular conference itself spoke of how some of them were ganja smokers, and someone came in Audi and so on before carrying out the terrorist attack. So they do come from affluent backgrounds. They are well educated and so on. But we also have characters like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was somebody who pioneered the whole ISIS movement. He was a criminal before becoming a jihadist leader. So there is this classic story of him talking to the Jordanian police officer and saying that, look, that he cannot be de-radicalized anymore because he's gone too far in appropriating Islam, or he's seeking some form of redemption for his past acts and so on and so forth. So from an individual point of view, when you're talking about crime terror nexus, crime jihadist nexus, right? It is a medium for criminals to actually seek redemption for their past acts. Now that is one way of looking at it. The other way is that for many criminals, they know that they're criminals. They know that they're committing acts of violence. They know that they're committing acts of crime, but they want some form of legitimacy to what they're doing. So it is said that, very wrongly, though I disagree with many people saying this, that many people join the armed forces because they just want a license to kill, right? So which is a very wrong notion of looking at the armed forces and so on. But nevertheless, there is some logic in what people are trying to say. So similarly, here what happens is, many criminals who want to kill, who want to engage in acts of violence, they don't have a legitimate reason for what they're doing, or they can't wear the veil of anything that can give them offer their actions legitimacy. And that's where jihadism comes to play, right? The moment you carry out a jihadist act, for the world it is a jihadist act, but for the particular individual, it is just him or her fulfilling their own criminal tendencies. So that is where we see that this nexus builds at an individual level, because one feeds in to the other. Now that we've seen that how individuals operate, why individuals take to jihadism, why ex-criminals take, or former or continuing criminals take to jihadism. Now let's look at organized crime. Why organized criminal groups come together with jihadist causes, right? That is because organized criminal groups bring in their own set of skill sets, right? Eventually, all strategy is about matching means with ends, matching your limited resources to the kind of outcomes that you seek to achieve. So from that point of view, right, look at the kind of activities that organized criminal groups engage in. For example, gun running, right? It's not just smuggling of arms. Many a times we do see that these criminal groups get involved in some forms of gang wars and so on, right? Especially speaking of the city of Mumbai, or Bombay, as it was initially called. They were, before the Pakistani ISI reached out to the D Company to carry out the 1993 bomb blast, which was supposed to be followed by a case of assault, but that did not happen. But nevertheless, that is because there was pre-existing experience of these cadres getting involved in gang wars, these cadres engaging with the police in shootouts and so on. So they bring in two things. One, a certain degree of skill set, that is to engage with the police, to engage with the security forces. And second is a kind of readiness, right? Wherever the readiness to take action is missing, right? It takes a lot of energies of the leadership to motivate the cadres to conduct certain actions. But if the readiness and willingness is always there, it is a lot more easier on the part of the jihadist organizations. And let's take another form of organized criminal activity, that is drug trafficking, right? Why do jihadists have to collaborate with organizations that traffic in drugs? There again, we see a very strong utility, because when you look at the history of warfare and what drugs have done in warfare, it is found that it is one of the easiest ways to break the morale of the stronger force. Right, we've seen this in China in the past. We've seen this. Speaking of the Soviet-Afghan war, because that's what leads us to this whole concept of jihadism and so on, right? So what happened there? The cultivation of opium, and then converting it to heroin and so on, Why did the Americans actually encourage Pakistanis to go ahead and do this? That is because the Soviet troops who were posted in Afghanistan, they started to become addicted to opium. The morale of the forces started to weaken and so on. And today we see something similar happening to the Indian state of Punjab, right? Once upon a time, we had Punjab's economy doing really well. But today, when you look at Punjab, it is the youth are, by and large, in many parts of Punjab, they have become drug addicts. There is a significant weakening of the Punjab economy and so on. So when you talk of jihadism as a form of an offensive, it need not take the form of only, say, let's say, suicide bombing or Fidain attacks or so on. It is a multi-dimensional attack on the enemy, which includes which eventually has to lead to the total destruction of the enemy. So that also includes destroying certain intangible aspects of the enemy, such as morale, such as economic weakness and social cohesion and so on. And to that extent, the drug traffickers and the jihadists find a good fertile ground to cooperate with each other. And from an operational point of view, there is the third reason why they might collaborate with one another. That is, let's say, it could be evasion of authority. So, for example, jihadist organizations, they have come with a single motive, that is to sort of uproot the existing order and create an Islamic state, bring in the Sharia law, and so on and so forth. But their experience with dealing with state authorities, with the institutions of the state, is extremely minimal, right? Or they might not have it at all. Whereas the organized criminal groups, they know that they are in this business in violation of stated rules, and they are standing against the state authorities. So they have a vested interest in terms of understanding how the state institutions work. So, to give you an example, in 2008, the Mumbai attacks happened, right? But when the 10 Fidain attacks set sail from the coast of Pakistan and they were about to reach Mumbai, two things happened because obviously they had to keep the Indian authorities busy and not notice the incoming attackers, right? So one, they chose a day when India was there was a cricket match between India and England. So quite obviously, where in India where cricket is the largest religion, obviously everybody would be busy on that day. But even then, they couldn't take it for granted that the Indian Coast Guards or the police patrol would sort of be lax on that particular day. So what did they do? They made use of the Dawood Ibrahim gang to sort of to just to inform the Coast Guards that there's going to be a smuggling activity happening off the coast of Gujarat in the Run of Kutch area. Now, this was a deception because they wanted the Coast Guards to be busy in that particular region, so that the Mumbai coast would be relatively free for the attackers to enter, right? So all these kind of things, right? These are not tactics. These are not details that are easily available to jihadist organizations like the Lashkar-e-Taiba or something. But because they are in an alliance, because they are in collaboration with organized criminal groups that have long operated in India, that have long operated in the city of Mumbai, they have an understanding of how the security forces operate. They have an understanding of how the intelligence agencies operate. That gives them an advantage in terms of operational conduct, right? So, I mean, I could go on. There are lots when you talk of the reasons why jihadist groups cooperate with, organized criminal groups. But somewhere we need to take this conversation in a direction that will help us understand why this problem is difficult for the state agencies or for nation states to tackle. And in order to do that, we need to sort of conduct a meta-analysis of all that I said and try and understand how this conflicts with how nation states actually operate. Now, when you look at organized crime and terrorism, right, one of the biggest international organizations that looks at this is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm not saying that they do a fantastic job in terms of fighting this crime, but at least as far as providing data and in terms of informing scholars about this challenge, they have done quite a fantastic job. And what they say, if you go back to the year 2004, 2005, I mean, that's about 20 years ago, even there, they had identified right then that both terrorist organizations and organized criminal groups are rational actors, right? we generally reserve these terms such as rational actors and so on for nation states, for people who don't get into these kind of activities, right? I mean, there is a tendency for people to dismiss terrorists as some form of lunatics, some form of irrational people. But the UNODC clearly says that organized criminal groups and terrorist organizations are rational actors. They are clearly rational actors. Then what is the problem? Where does the problem lie? And in my understanding, I see that it is actually a clash of rationality between between the kind of rationality that the organized criminal groups and jihadists exude, and the kind of rationality that actors actually exude. So when you look at everything that I mentioned so far about the nexus between organized criminal groups and jihadists, right? The kind of rationality that they sort of portray is what we could call in the Weberian language as pragmatic rationality, right? And because why do they do that? Because pragmatism gives you a certain sense of flexibility and adaptability. So, whereas the security forces, nation states, are built on a very different kind of rationality, what we can call as theoretical or formal rationality, where there is a certain abstract about, let's say, abstract things like national interest, abstract things like bureaucratic interests or organizational interests. And most nation states and most organizations are their operational methods, their operating systems are built on this abstract notion. So what happens is, while the pragmatic rationality gives the organized criminal groups and terrorist organizations the much needed flexibility and adaptability, nation states and their intelligence and security agency and bureaucracies are operating on a formal rationality that builds not adaptability but obstructionism. Now I know it got a bit loaded with jargon, so I'll use a real life example to sort of help you all understand how this operates. From an operational point of view, here is the example. When the 2008 Mumbai attacks happened, before the attacks happened, the Lashkar-e-Taiba wanted to conduct a surveillance and reconnaissance of some of the key targets that they would likely attack. And in order to do it, they sent out a person who was an American. His name was he's today famously known as David Headley, but his former name was Daud Gilani. The Lashkar-e-Taiba chose him because he was an American, and he could easily evade the detection by Indian security agencies, because an American going around clicking pictures in the city of Mumbai would not generally gather much of an attention from the security forces. But here's the complexity, right? Why? Because David Headley, he was caught in Denmark in 2009. And the moment he was caught in Denmark, he revealed that he was an informer of the US Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, right? So he was an agent of the DEA, and now our suspicion is that the Americans were using him and his collaboration with the elite to sort of try and get to Osama bin Laden, because Al Qaeda was operating in Pakistan, and we know that in 2011 Osama bin Laden was taken out by the US Navy SEALs in Pakistan. So the suspicion was that the Americans wanted to get to Osama bin Laden, and in order to get to Osama bin Laden, they were using the elite Al Qaeda alliance, and they were using David Headley to get to Osama bin Laden. Now, the second layer of complexity is that the elite sort of suspected that the Americans were actually doing this. So what they did was they sought to ignore this bit, but they said that okay, it's okay, even if they're trying to get to Osama bin Laden through us, so be it. But we can utilize this person to gather intelligence about the targets in India because he's an American, right? Now look at the kind of adaptability that is available to the jihadist organizations. They could adapt to a situation which was clearly hostile to them. Now look at it from the state response side. Now, the Americans learned quite a lot about the planning of 2611 and so on, but they could not inform India. Why? Because they were driven by a bureaucratic rationality, a formal rationality that said that we are here to protect our own national interests. We are here to protect our own bureaucratic interests. So, from our security point of view, we can't reveal our source. So, we will limit what we can share with India, right? So on the one hand, you had the Lashkar-e-Taiba use somebody who was clearly a threat to their organization in a flexible manner, whereas the United States intelligence agencies and the United States government could not use David Headley to the extent that they could stop the 26/11 attack from happening. So operationally, you see that the two different rationalities that are operating on the terrorist side and the organized criminal side, and the rationality that is operating on the nation state side, they are bound to clash, and one is going to be the victor over the other. Now, this example was from an operational point of view, right? Now, let me give you a strategic example as well. Go back to the example of 1993, where I was saying that Lieutenant General Javed Nasir, who was the ISI's, who 2 days after the blast was made the DG of the ISI, and later on he became the chairman of the SGPC as well. Today, we quite clearly know that the Khalistan movement itself is comprised of criminals of all kinds, right? You have people who are capable of making fake passports, providing fake travel documents. You have people who are involved in human trafficking and human smuggling. You have people who are involved in gang running, gun running, and so on. You have people based out of Canada and United States who are calling the shots and ordering hits in India. So there is a deep nexus between Khalistani terrorists and their own, criminal elements. But at the same time, this Khalistani movement, Khalistani terrorism, is not an independent movement by itself, right? We have time and again, we have seen that they are in nexus with jihadist organizations like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. We have also had former SGPC chairmen who are Sikhs speak favorably about Hafiz Saeed or, and other leaders of the jihadist movements. So you see, even though there is a fundamental difference between Sikhism and Islamism, there is a fundamental difference between the two religions and their respective goals. They are able to come together and operate as one unit, and that's how the Pakistani state also, the ISI came up with this plan known as Plan K2M, that is Kashmir, Khalistan, and the Muslim militancy. This triangular threat has to operate in a fashion that leads to the breakup of India. So that is the kind of strategic coalition that are being built, irrespective of what their tactical objectives or their end goals are. But finally, they are coming together in one form or the other. Now, this is from the organized groups on the jihadist side, where strategically they're finding an alliance because of that form of rationality, which gives them flexibility. But look at what is happening at the level of nation states. The United States is unwilling to believe that this is form of the Khalistani movement, the Khalistani terrorism is connected to the larger aspect of jihadism in the subcontinent. They're seeing it as a standalone threat, which is connected to something that they call as freedom of speech violation. So undermining of democracy and so on and so forth. So both the United States and Canada are now unwilling or incapable of taking action against this. Why? Because they are operating under a very different kind of rationality. And that rationality is determined by, let's say, their own national interest. That rationality is determined by their own sense of abstract notions of democracy, abstract notions of free speech, abstract notions of human rights, and so on, right? So that is where both operationally and strategically, we see that there is a clash of rationality that operates on the side of organized criminal groups and terrorists, and the rationality that operates on the side of nation states. Finally, going forward, speaking of flexibility and adaptability, right? I have worked with the Karnataka State Police quite extensively in the recent past, and so we have observed, and this is also something that one of the previous speakers in the last session spoke about how jihadism and terrorism is changing its face in India. It's no more taking the form of mass suicidal attacks and so on, but it is coming in the form of riots. Right, it's coming in the form of riots. For example, in 2020, we noticed that in 2020, the city of Bangalore, there was something known as the Bangalore riots, where two police stations in Bangalore were attacked by a mob of Muslims after there was a Facebook post made that was sort of critical or mocking the Holy Prophet. So when this happened, there was an attack on the two police stations. But when we try to investigate and see how this attack could actually happen, how did the mobilization actually happen, we found that there were WhatsApp groups that were in operation, like and under very innocuous names, right? And one of, like, for example, one of the group was called "My Kai Kadmo Ke Niche Jannat," right? Like, that is, the heavens are under my fist and feet. which has nothing to do with say Islamic Jihad or anything. But when investigations were conducted, and when we saw the kind of conversations that had happened within those chat rooms and so on, we realized groups and so on, we realized that that's where large scale mobilization happened, and this was possible because many of these individuals, right, they had, you know, they were petty criminals, so again, when you're talking, looking at it from the lens of the flexible rationality, right, pragmatic rationality, they could be used to carry out. I mean, they would not probably lend themselves to mass casualty terrorism, but in terms of pelting stones, attacking police stations in a mass mob where you could easily evade arrests and so on, they would be more than willing to do it. Right now, but on the other hand, you have the police forces, not only in the state of Karnataka, but elsewhere across India. The rationality that guides the police is that make sure that you don't record too many cases. Why? Because eventually you don't want to show it to the world that within your own jurisdiction there is so much of crime. So many of the petty crimes don't get registered. Now, when we look at crime terror nexus, right, the mistake that we make is that we always look at the nexus between these grand organized crime groups like the D Company and so on, which is indeed a problem. But from a purely operational point of view, you don't really need to collaborate with such deadly organized crime groups. All you need to do is collaborate with 3 or 4 petty criminals, and together you can come and carry out an attack, right? So, in order to stop that, we need the security agencies to register as many cases as possible, because at the first indication that somebody is getting radicalized, he or she can be picked up on any of the particular crimes that they are they have criminal cases against them. This is important because I'll give you an example of what happened in 2022 when the Mangaluru blast had happened. When the Mangaluru, the blast happened in the auto rickshaw, right? He was radicalized in a prison in a place called Belgaum in North Karnataka. And the guy who radicalized him was a member of the elite. And what this member of the elite did was he wanted certain cadres, and he wanted certain people who he could radicalize. So he picked a bunch of them, but he needed a space where they could be radicalized. Now they all had to be put in one place. So how do you put them all in one place? Because in prisons you have this particular candidate who was caught in terrorism in high security detail, whereas others are in less security detail. So a riot broke out in the prison, and then they all had to be moved to a place where they could all, be put together, because now they were all high security risks. So once they all got together, that's where the radicalization and so on happened. And once they came out, they had their own networks where they could talk to each other. They could, share their skills and so on, which led to firstly a stabbing spree in 2022 in a place called Shimoga on the day of Independence Day and so on. So the point that I'm making here is this radicalization that happened in the prison. It happened, one, because criminals knew how the prison systems operated, that they could cause a riot and get themselves moved to one place, which is the existing knowledge that we are talking about at the start of at somewhere at the start of my presentation. Eventually, when it came to the conduct of the act, right? One was that these are all petty criminals. They were not massive gangsters who carried out the attacks. And second, why were they outside? Why were they released? They were released because many of the crimes, many of the petty crimes are either not recorded, or the weakness in the judicial system is such that they can easily get out of the prison in no time. Like I literally saw one. I was going through the documents in one of the registered cases on terrorism in Bangalore, and the defending lawyer, advocate, who was who was trying to defend the actions committed by those suspects. In one instance, he goes on to say that merely gathering and accumulating, explosive material does not constitute as an act of terrorism. And surprisingly, that is how it is. Simply because you have certain material that can be used for any forms of terrorism, that is not a criminal act. So what happens is that both the Indian security forces and the Indian judiciary, they're fighting with at least one hand tied behind their back, right? So finally, I'll just conclude by saying that on the one hand, you have a rationality of adaptability, which takes into consideration every factor where they can operate. On the other hand, you have a rationality of a formal rationality, which is inherently obstructionist, right? Finally, I'll just make one quick point before I conclude, because this is important. Because when we're talking about because this is because when you look at crime terror nexus, right? You look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, you'll see that there is a massive poppy cultivation. So there are certain tribes who are involved in that form of cultivation. You look at Israel, the problem is again, many people talk about the Bedouin tribes that are around Israel. They have their own livelihood problems and so on. You talk of Nigeria, Northwest Nigeria, you have banditry, which is in coalition with Boko Haram and so on. So the point here is that when there are economic weaknesses, when there are problems, social problems, it allows the jihadist organizations and organized crime groups to a fertile ground for recruitment. And that is something that nation states need to remember, because what is happening now is, again, going back to the formal rationality, right? What the United States thinks now is that if we can cut down poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, that will immediately put a halt or obstruct the
I think Dheeraj's connection has gone off. So,
Yes, sir.
uh, so what we will do is, yeah,
Sir, I
Dheeraj,
think Dheeraj sir has joined from different ID.
yeah,
Yeah,
Yes,
sorry,
there is.
sorry, sorry, sorry. Am I audible now?
yeah, conclude, Dheeraj. I think you've
Okay, sir.
gone.
Okay. In conclusion, all that I'm trying to say is that there are so just giving you the example of Afghanistan, right, where poppy cultivation now, the United States has asked Taliban to ban the cultivation of poppy, which the Taliban has now enforced. With no other options, now the farmers are moving towards crystal meth and so on, which are again deadly forms of drugs, and So the point being that nation states have a responsibility in terms of presenting economic and social development opportunities to people, so that we can deny one of the key resources on which jihadist organizations and organized crime groups rely, that is people, right? So with that, I'll end my presentation by saying that we need to have a clear understanding of these two kinds of rationality that are operating. Without being able to differentiate between these two rationalities, it is going to be difficult to tackle the to tackle the challenge posed by crime terror nexus. Thank you very much.